In 1898, with the signing of the Treaty of Paris after the Spanish-American War, the US first began its rise as a superpower. It gained control of Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam. The aftermath of World War II cemented the US, along with the Soviet Union, as the world's two superpowers. And with the collapse of the latter, the US emerged in the early 90s as the world's sole economic and military superpower, a position it has more or less held ever since. This has, in at least a sense of the American population, created a feeling of complacency and invincibility in terms of its military. The belief that their country will always triumph and be victorious. This can be seen in countless movies, TV shows, songs, and video games, whether the foe be Russia, or some terrorist group, or even from outer space. While it is true that right now, it is arguably the most powerful nation in the world, that is slowly beginning to change. But first, our sponsor, Miras Safety. If you are worried at all about world events, war breaking out, terrorist attacks, even natural disasters like wildfires, biological threats either man-made or from nature, or even industrial accidents, don't be caught off guard. Miras Safety has the highest quality gas masks and suits to protect yourself, your family, even children. They are used by military, law enforcement, and industry professionals across the world. It's not something you would normally think of, and something you'd probably rather not think about, but this can make all the difference in the world. Miras Safety provides protection against it all: chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear. Use coupon code CABAL10, no space, for 10% off your first order. Check them out at mirasafety.com. The idea of the US being unstoppable seems to have its roots in the aftermath of World War II. The US emerged victorious over Germany and Japan, two powerful countries that dominated vast swaths of the planet, with Germany controlling most of Europe, and Japan much of Asia and the Pacific Ocean. While this victory was absolutely not won alone, the US undoubtedly came out of World War II in the most advantageous position. It did not lose millions of soldiers and citizens, its cities were not left in rubble and its economy destroyed, and it gained massive influence over Western Europe, the Pacific Ocean, and Eastern Asia. The end of the Cold War only further reinforced this idea of supremacy. For decades, there were only two superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union. With the collapse of the latter, the US became by far the most powerful nation on Earth. No other nation could match the US in a direct military confrontation. But most defining battles are not so direct. There have been many battles throughout history where deception and asymmetrical warfare has enabled a significantly weaker power to win. The US war in Vietnam and the Soviet war in Afghanistan are two examples where a much more powerful military force was arguably defeated by a much weaker enemy. In 2001, the world's sole superpower was unable to stop the terrorist attacks of 9/11. A lightly armed, poorly funded group halfway across the world was able to inflict more damage to the US mainland than the military powerhouses of Germany and Japan during World War II. After 9/11, the general feeling was that the US would find and destroy this group and emerge victorious once again. After all, if the US could defeat Germany and Japan after only a few years, this war should be over in a matter of months. Little did anyone know that the war in Afghanistan would end up costing over $1 trillion and become the longest war in US history, still going on today. In fact, there are those on the opposite side of this myth, those that say, since World War II, the US has never won a single war. From being forced out of North Korea by the Chinese late in the Korean War, to Vietnam, even Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Syria today. This is debatable. It all depends on what you define as winning a war. It can also be argued that the war in Afghanistan and Iraq was won. The US defeated the militaries of each and took over control of the government pretty quickly, and that the current role of US forces in these countries is more that of law enforcement. One aspect of this myth manifests itself in regards to weapons. The refusal to believe or admit that a Russian or Chinese weapon could be superior to that American one. Certain land-based air defenses and many anti-ship missiles, for example. I've had many discussions with people who believe that the S-300 and even the S-400 is inferior to American Hawk and Patriot air defenses, often calling them, quote, paper tigers. While no version of the S-300 or 400 is confirmed to have been used in combat, all available evidence points toward them being highly capable systems. This includes its radar specifications, range of the missile, the capabilities of previous Soviet air defenses, and more. There has always been an impression in the US that Russian weaponry is more brute force, using overwhelming firepower, muscling their way through any deficiencies in technology by using more weapons, larger vehicles and aircraft, or simply throwing more manpower at the enemy. This compared to how they see the US, using more precision weapons with more advanced technology, which is much more reliable than Soviet and later Russian weaponry. This idea likely dates back to World War II, where the Soviet Union did have to revert to tactics that are reminiscent of human wave attacks, due to their lack of more advanced weapons and funding brought about by the massive damage their economy and industrial factories received from the German invasion. However, this overall idea is not correct. The Soviet Union was able to develop some pretty incredibly advanced, reliable, and highly capable weapons of war, many of which were superior to that of the US. And today, Russia, in some ways, continues to do so. Even during the 1980s, where after a decade of economic stagnation, according to the US Department of Defense, the Soviet Union was leading the US in 28 fields of applied science, and projected to further increase that lead in the future to 40. While the Soviet Union, and later Russia, faced extreme economic difficulty in the following years, their decades of investment in science and scientists paid off. One obvious example is Russia's space program. Right now, the Soyuz rocket and spacecraft is the only way to get humans into space, if you don't count the occasional Chinese manned launches. Since the retirement of the space shuttle, the US has not had any ability to do so. Some US launch vehicles even use Russian rocket engines, due to their higher performance over available American rocket engines. The RD-180 and the RD-181 are used on the American Atlas V and Antares rocket, respectively. There is also evidence showing that the US has fallen behind in another major warfighting technology, hypersonics. Russia says it already has active hypersonic missiles, and released images seem to show China is developing a hypersonic drone. While the US has tested a few different hypersonic platforms over the past 20 years, these projects appear to have been cancelled. Now the US has to play catch-up. And this brings up another point. After the end of the Cold War, where America was left as a sole superpower, defense spending dropped dramatically. Research and development on cutting-edge weapon systems was sidelined, as there was no urgent need for such weapons. As such, the rate of technological advancement in terms of defense dropped significantly. On top of this, the US Congress was hesitant to approve many large, expensive new projects, instead sticking with producing more of the same. For example, the Patriot air defense system, the Harpoon anti-ship missile, the M1 Abrams main battle tank, the E-2 and the E-3 airborne early warning aircraft, and many, many more, all having been designed during the Cold War, and still built and used today. Now granted, each one of these has been upgraded and improved in the years since, but it is still the same base platform, whereas during the Cold War, multiple generations with revolutionary new designs and capabilities were built in the same period of time. Another reason for this myth of the impressions of infallibility comes down to military spending. The US spends nearly 3 times more than the second highest spender, China, and 10 times more than Russia. So it makes sense to have this impression. For the amount of money being spent on defense, its weaponry should be the best. Well, there are many reasons why this is not always the case. One main one would be, compared to China and Russia, the US has military bases and is conducting operations across the world. For 2019, the US is stated to spend more than the entire defense budget of Russia in the war on terror in the Middle East alone. The US operates an estimated 800 plus military bases of varying sizes across the globe. The cost of operating these bases is extremely difficult to calculate for many reasons, but believed to be around $150 billion a year. A nation like China, who operates very few overseas bases and is not currently involved in any costly wars, can devote much more of their defense spending to research, development, and procurement of weaponry. Also, when you have less money, you tend to be more frugal with it. You cannot afford to waste money or have costly, long, drawn-out experimental projects only to be cancelled a year later. And finally, the future. Currently, the US military could be considered the most powerful in the world. With its massive navy, by far the largest air force in the world, and a large army spread across the earth, There is no other conventional military in the world that matches it. That, however, does not mean it's unstoppable. Even today, a war with Iran could be devastating for the US. Iran has a large arsenal of conventional and asymmetrical capabilities. There are several large US air bases well within range of Iranian missiles, and even a carrier strike group could fall victim to Iran's stockpiles of anti-ship missiles. A war with China would be even worse. It would be almost certainly impossible for the US to successfully invade the nation. China has built up their military at an incredible pace over the last 2 decades, and is only getting more powerful. If they continue at the current rate, China will surpass the US, possibly within a decade. The Russian military has also been growing in size and capability over the last 20 years. With the military growth of these two, along with nations like Iran and North Korea, America's monopoly on being the sole world military superpower is slowly being chipped away. Those who do believe in this myth, that couldn't comprehend the possibility that the US could lose a war, may be in for a rude awakening, with the truth slowly but steadily becoming apparent.